On August 28, 1963, about 250,000 people marched to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to protest for jobs and freedom. Earlier that year, police took violent measures against peaceful colored protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, which brought national attention to the civil rights issue and landed Martin Luther King Jr. in jail. Inspired by the Birmingham protests, Martin Luther King Jr. assumed the responsibility to speak out against racial injustices at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The March on Washington contributed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, resulting in prohibitions on racial discrimination and the establishment of equal voting rights that are still in effect to this day. Since the end of slavery, blacks were discriminated against and segregated from whites. In the South, Jim Crow laws prevented African Americans from having much contact with whites, which were literally their rights.
Jim Crow was based upon a minstrel show that was going around in the early 1800s called Jim Crow. So the term, in a variety of different ways, became a norm with respect to understanding how segregation would manifest itself in terms of race in America. Thus the Jim Crow laws.
An abundance of these laws were found only in the South, where nearly everything was segregated, including water fountains, movie theaters, doors, and schools. African Americans were discriminated against in a variety of ways, especially in the workplace. African Americans were not hired because of the color of their skin. The African Americans that were hired would receive lower pay than the white employees. As a result, paychecks didn't support black families as well as they did white families. African Americans wanted change, and they wanted it immediately. They wanted equal treatment and opportunities as whites. To express this idea, they conducted many protests in an effort to change the segregation system. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, planned a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. The march was canceled when Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which forbade discrimination by any defense contractors and established the Fair Employment Practices Committee, known as the FEPC, to investigate charges of racial discrimination. Boycotts, sit-ins, and many other protests were conducted all over the southern United States, and the demonstrations eventually gained changes to laws. When African Americans conducted these peaceful protests, they risked being jailed or beaten by the police. Some African Americans were even killed. The most tragic, horrifying, and shocking images were those of the civil rights protests in Birmingham, Alabama, where police, led by Eugene Bull Connor, brutally abused colored protesters with high-powered water hoses and police dogs because they were protesting against segregation laws. These images were displayed on television and newspapers for the whole nation to see. The Lincoln Memorial was a fitting stage for civil rights demonstrations because many people thought that the freedom Lincoln promised had not been achieved. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was intended to emphasize Lincoln's promise. The Big Six organizers and hired staff organized the march and traveled around the country persuading people to attend. Besides recruiting people, organizers were responsible for managing the transportation, fundraising, printing leaflets and brochures, and more. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom demanded meaningful civil rights laws, decent housing, massive federal works program, full and fair employment, the right to vote, and adequate integrated education. On June 11, 1963, President Kennedy proposed on television to ban racial discrimination, provide protection to black voters, and to integrate schools. After civil rights leaders refused to cancel the march upon Kennedy's request, Kennedy encouraged administration officials to comply with them. Washington, D.C. prepared for the largest, most violent protest by setting up military bases and preparing armed soldiers to send in if the protest went wrong.
Most people were afraid.
Because you didn't know what was going to happen in Washington.
That's right.
Whether they were going to start shooting, whether it was going to be another William Pettis Bridge incident, or you didn't know what was going to happen.
Right.
The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom surprised the world with its feats. People from all around the country traveled by car, bus, and even by foot to be involved in the most amazing march in history. The predicted 100,000 people turned out to be 250,000, and 1/4 of the participants were white. The number of people in attendance showed how badly the country wanted equality for all people, no matter their race, religion, or gender. There were many celebrity performances, including Joan Baez, Marian Anderson, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson.
When a celebrity gets involved in a variety of different institutions, organizations, or different social movements, those individuals that follow them, there will be a host of those individuals that will be made aware of those issues just because of the celebrities' involvement.
An abundance of people gave speeches. The most inspiring speech of the day was that of Martin Luther King Jr. His I Have a Dream speech argues for the founders' promise for freedom. King eloquently stated America's goal for equality and how no human being should discriminate another human being. He changed people's views of the nation by showing them the hatred and disrespect that lived in that time period.
So the main idea at the end with respect to this dream was about human brotherhood and equality.
Everyone was behind Martin Luther King. No one wanted violence. You know, we were sick of it.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
James Weston of the New York Times writes, "It had the force of numbers, it had the melodies of both the church and the theater, and it was able to invoke the principle of the Founding Fathers to rebuke the inequalities and hypocrisies of modern American life."
We believe that it's going to have its effect on the image of our country all over the world, because it will indicate that not only are Negroes struggling to achieve a transition from second-class to first-class citizenship, but that our white brothers and sisters are marching arm in arm with the Negro citizens of the country for the purpose of achieving this objective.
The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was a huge success. Unfortunately, our great President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 12, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. A few months later, the House of Representatives passed a final version of the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. By the end of 1966, 4 out of 13 southern states had less than 50% of African Americans registered to vote. On April 4, 1968, the world lost an amazing leader, activist, and preacher. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot dead outside his second-floor room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. After King's death was announced, there were outbreaks of racial violence, which caused 40 deaths nationwide.
Every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That isn't important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others.
On April 7th, President Lyndon B. Johnson demanded a national day of mourning for the civil rights leader. For the next few days, public libraries, museums, and schools and businesses were closed, and sporting events and the Academy Awards ceremony were postponed. Today, King's legacy can be found anywhere in the United States. Although Martin Luther King Jr. had passed, his dream has prospered greatly by the decrease in segregation and discrimination. During the mid-1960s, 41% of black families lived in poverty. In 2013, there were only 25% of black families that live in poverty. 50 years after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, America celebrates the march's 50th anniversary and elects a black president twice. Barack Obama is the first black president in history. Other accomplishments in King's dream include black colleges, students, and black politicians. There are many achievements regarding Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, but there are still some gaps that America needs to fill. There are still people who think blacks are never up to any good.
There are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me.
The consistent acts of racism and discrimination show that America does not yet have equal rights for everyone, and therefore must take responsibility to change that.
We've come a long way as a country and as a race, but we still have a long way to go.
It's gone too far.